The soft hum of the air conditioner filled the room as I stared at the flickering glow of my phone screen. My mind kept wandering back to the family reunion last weekend, replaying moments I couldn't quite shake off. Jesse, my older cousin, had always been charming, effortlessly so. But that night, there was something different about him, a lingering gaze, a tone in his voice that seemed heavier, charged. I shook my head, trying to push the thoughts aside, but they refused to leave. The way his hand had accidentally brushed against mine as we reached for the same plate, it should have been nothing. Yet, the warmth of his touch lingered, like an ember refusing to die. The memory of his laugh echoed in my mind. It was the kind of laugh that made people feel comfortable, but for some reason, it had left me uneasy. I'd caught him glancing at me more than once that night, his eyes holding a quiet intensity one couldn't decipher. As I sat there, the scent of his cologne seemed to linger in the air, even though he wasn't here. It was ridiculous, really. Why couldn't I let this go? I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, a product of overthinking. But deep down, I knew there was something unspoken hanging in the air between us. When I returned to the kitchen that evening, I'd found Jesse leaning against the counter, his phone in his hand. He looked up at me, smiled, and said something about how grown-up I was now. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered just a moment too long. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, brushing it off with a nervous laugh. Now, sitting here in the quiet of my room, I felt a strange mix of curiosity and unease. Why did it feel like he saw something in me that even I didn't understand? The following evening, I found myself alone in the living room, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. The reunion's chatter had faded, and most of the family had gone to bed. Jesse walked in, carrying 2 mugs of hot coffee. He placed one in front of me and sat down, his presence filling the quiet room. "You looked like you needed this," he said with a soft smile, sliding the mug closer to me. "Thanks," I murmured, my fingers brushing against his as I reached for it. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt amplified, like the air between us had thickened. Jesse leaned back, his eyes scanning the room before settling on me. "You know, Maria," he began, his voice low, "you've really grown up. It's strange, I still think of you as the little girl running around at these reunions." I smiled, but his words stirred something in me, an unease I couldn't place. "Well, I'm not a little girl anymore," I replied, keeping my tone light, though my heart was beating faster. We talked for a while about mundane things, college, work, life, but there was a subtle current beneath our words. At one point, he reached over, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from my face. "You've got chocolate on your cheek," he said with a chuckle. His touch lingered a moment longer than necessary, and my breath caught. I looked up at him, and for the briefest second, his gaze held something unspoken: curiosity, admiration. Whatever it was, it sent a shiver down my spine. Later, as we stood to leave, he pulled me into a hug. It wasn't unusual, we hugged all the time. But this hug felt different. His arms wrapped around me firmly, his hand resting lightly on my lower back. He held on just a little longer than usual, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away first. When we finally separated, he looked down at me, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Maria," he said softly, his voice tinged with something I couldn't quite identify. I climbed into bed that night, his scent still clinging to my sweater, my thoughts a tangled mess. Why did it feel like every moment with Jesse was charged with something more? Something neither of us dared to name. The air between Jesse and me had become nearly unbearable. Every glance, every accidental touch, carried a weight that neither of us acknowledged aloud. The next evening, after most of the family had gone to bed, we found ourselves alone in the kitchen. Jesse was leaning against the counter, his shirt sleeves rolled up, revealing his forearms. I tried to focus on cleaning up, but I could feel his gaze on me. "Need help?" he asked, his voice low and calm. "No, I'm good," I said quickly, though my hands trembled slightly as I rinsed a plate. He stepped closer, his presence warm and solid behind me. "You're always taking care of everyone else. Let someone take care of you for a change," he murmured, his voice near my ear. I turned to respond, but the words caught in my throat when I realized how close he was. Jesse reached out, his fingers brushing mine as he took the dish towel from my hand. The light contact sent a jolt through me, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Our eyes locked, and his expression softened. Slowly, almost hesitantly, he reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His knuckles grazed my cheek, lingering just a moment too long. "Maria," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, but he trailed off as if unsure of what to say next. Without thinking, I stepped back, but not away. The counter pressed into my back, and Jesse followed, closing the space between us. His hand found mine, and he laced our fingers together. The way he held on, tighter than necessary, made it clear he didn't want to let go. "You're trembling," he said, his thumb brushing over the back of my hand. I didn't know how to respond. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. His free hand lightly touched my arm, tracing upward in a slow, deliberate motion until it rested just below my shoulder. "Jesse," I whispered, unsure if it was a plea to stop or to keep going. His face was close now, so close I could feel his breath against my skin. He hesitated for a moment, his gaze searching mine, before he leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. The contact was brief but electrifying, leaving me breathless. When he pulled back, his expression was conflicted, as if he was wrestling with himself. I shouldn't have done that," he said, releasing my hand and stepping back, though his eyes lingered on me. My chest tightened at the loss of his warmth, but I didn't move, rooted in place by the storm of emotions swirling within me. Neither of us spoke as he walked away, leaving the room in silence. But the tension he left behind was almost suffocating, an unspoken promise that this wasn't over. That night, the storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging within me. The power had gone out, leaving the house cloaked in darkness, but Jesse's presence illuminated everything. We were the only two awake, sitting by the fireplace in the living room, the flickering flames casting shadows that seemed to dance with the tension between us. Jesse was quiet, his gaze fixed on the fire, but his hand rested just inches from mine on the couch. The silence was thick, heavy with the weight of all the things we weren't saying. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained. "Maria, I've been trying to fight this, but I can't anymore." I turned to look at him, my breath catching as I saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "Jesse, He moved closer, his knee brushing against mine. His hand reached out, hesitating for a moment before cupping my cheek. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through me, and I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "Our lives are complicated," he whispered, his forehead resting gently against mine. "But whatever this is between us, it feels inevitable." My heart was pounding so loudly I thought it might drown out his words. I closed my eyes, letting myself feel the closeness, the way his breath mingled with mine. And then it happened. His lips found mine, soft and hesitant at first, as if testing whether this was real. The kiss was a release of all the unspoken tension, all the moments we'd held ourselves back. My hands instinctively reached for him, one resting on his shoulder, the other trailing down to his back. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer as if he couldn't stand the space between us. The kiss deepened, filled with an urgency that left me breathless. "Maria," he murmured against my lips, his voice laced with both longing and fear. "I can't imagine not having this moment with you." My fingers threaded through his hair as I whispered back, "I feel the same, Jesse. But where does this leave us?" His answer was another kiss, one that seemed to say everything he couldn't put into words. For that moment, the world outside didn't exist. It was just us, lost in a whirlwind of emotions that neither of us could control. When we finally pulled apart, our foreheads touched, and we stayed like that, holding onto each other as if afraid the spell might break. Whatever happened next, we both knew there was no going back. The night had passed in a blur, and morning light began to seep through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Jesse and I sat together in the silence, each lost in our own thoughts, processing everything that had just transpired. The weight of the moment was still heavy in the air, but there was a sense of peace between us now, even amidst the uncertainty of what came next. Jesse ran a hand through his hair, his eyes distant, yet I could see the change in him. He looked more settled, as if the storm inside him had quieted, at least for now. "I don't know where we go from here, Maria," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken questions. "But I can't just ignore what happened between us." I nodded, understanding. I felt the same way. The connection we'd shared, the emotions that had surfaced, there was no denying the depth of it. But reality was never simple. Our lives, our choices, were all tangled in complications we couldn't easily untangle. Looking at him now, I saw the vulnerability in his eyes, the conflict that still lingered. "I never expected any of this to happen," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "But I don't regret it, Jesse." There was a pause, a moment where the future hung uncertainly between us. Then, slowly, he reached for my hand. It wasn't a desperate grip, but a gentle hold, as if to remind me we were still connected, even if the path ahead was unclear. "We'll figure it out, Maria," he said, his voice more sure now, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "But no matter what happens, last night it meant something. And I'll always carry that with me." I squeezed his hand, a tear slipping down my cheek despite myself. It wasn't sadness I felt, but something more complex, a mixture of longing, hope, and a touch of fear for what the future might hold. As I stood up to leave, I glanced back at him, the weight of our shared moment still lingering. A part of me wanted to stay, to hold on to this fleeting connection, but I knew it was time to step away. There was no going back to what we had before, but in some strange way, that was okay. As I walked away, I took a deep breath, knowing that whatever happened next, I would never forget the way he made me feel, the way we both had dared to open ourselves to something that could never be undone.